Hello everyone and welcome to the Marketing Cloud API series. In the previous video, you have seen how to invoke REST API calls using AMPscript from a landing page. In this video, we will see how to invoke SOAP API using AMPscript from a landing page. Now in AMPscript, we need to know these functions in order to perform SOAP API calls. The first one is CreateObject, the second one is setObjectProperty, then we have addObjectArrayItem, and then depending upon the type of operation you want to perform, you have multiple invoke functions. So it could be like invoke create, invoke retrieve, invoke execute, invoke delete, etc. Okay, so we'll look at the documentation for each of these as well. Okay, so for the first one that we have here is CreateObject, right? So this one we will primarily use for instantiating a SOAP object. Okay, and I will show you shortly, like what the different objects and methods are in the SOAP reference. And then once you instantiate an object, we will use the setObjectProperty function to set one or more properties for that object. So if you come to the reference here, select on setObjectProperty, it will show you an example of, okay, once I've created an object, how do I set the properties for that particular object? Like I can have one or more properties that I can set using this particular function. Okay. And then in the example, we will look at a data extension object, and I'll show you what are the different properties that you can configure for that, right? Now, sometimes you may also have an array of items or objects you will need to specify within an object. So in this particular case, you will have to use the addObjectArrayItem function as well. Okay, so here, if you have already an object that you have instantiated, and then let's say you have an array that is of items attributes. Okay, so the array is called attribute, and you have multiple attributes that you want to add as array items into that particular array, then you can actually use the addObjectArrayItem. Okay, so we will see one of this also as part of the example, like when you have the data extension, you have multiple fields that you will enter, right? So those are all added as array items. So we will see that as part of the example as well. Okay, now these three functions that we just saw, CreateObject, setObjectProperty, and addObjectArrayItem, they are primarily used to create the body of the SOAP object and its properties. Okay, they are similar to an actual SOAP envelope XML, if you have seen the SOAP envelope. So once you have the body, you can then perform the appropriate operation for the parent object using the invoke function. So you will see here all the various invoke functions. So if you want to create something, you have to use the invoke create. Okay, if you want to retrieve, you have to use the invoke retrieve. So we will be actually creating a data extension as part of our sample scenario today, and for that we will use the invoke create. Okay, so you can see an example here as well, like it uses all the create object, then the set object property, and the add object array item, and then finally it says invoke create, and then it will return the status code, and based on the status code, if it is not okay, you can actually raise an error as well. Okay, now one thing you need to note is that for the SOAP API calls, we do not need to use any access token or authentication when you're using it from AMPscript. Okay, you can directly invoke the functions and pass the object and the properties data for processing to the platform. Okay, so now let's look at the SOAP envelope that is there in that we've used in some of our previous videos when we did SOAP request from Postman, right? So this is actually a create data extension request in our SOAP API request under the Marketing Cloud APIs package. So you will see here, that you can configure the create request to have a data extension created. Okay, and then you will see that this is the main crux of the envelope data that will be used for creating that particular data extension. Okay, so we'll try to understand some of these tags, so then you'll be able to map that and then create the actual AMPscript code, right? So unless and until you really understand okay, how do you actually translate these into objects and properties, you will not be able to write the code for it, right? So the root level here is the primary object that we are trying to create. Okay, in this particular case, we are trying to create a data extension object, right? So the first thing that we will need to do is go ahead and create a data extension object, and then within that you have all these tags. So these are all properties for this particular data extension object, right? So client is a property, customer key, name, category. So these are all properties that you have, including sendable data extension, etc. Now when you come to fields, okay, this is slightly different. You will see fields is actually an array of multiple fields. Okay, and each field that you have is a type of data extension field. Okay, So there is another object called data extension field as well. Now you might be wondering how I know most of this stuff, right? So this is primarily from the documentation. Okay, so how you need to understand what is the object that I need to create, okay, what are the properties for that particular object, when do I need to go, create child objects, all these things, like, you can actually refer to the documentation, right? So when you Google for like Marketing Cloud SOAP objects, you will be able to get this particular page. So under the SOAP web service API, click on objects. So it will list all the different objects that are supported by the SOAP API. Okay, and there's a lot of it, like, so you can the many common ones that you can actually see are the ones that I've just shown you here. Is the data extension. Definitely you may end up using as well. So in our exercise we are going to use the data extension object. Okay, now keep in mind there are two different types here, like one is data extension, one is data extension object. The data extension object is actually a row within a data extension, so don't get confused. The one that we need is to actually create the DE, right? So we have to use the data extension one. Okay, now so the object here is data extension, and then you will see a bunch of properties here. So these are all the various tags that you saw in that Postman, the Postman envelope, the SOAP envelope that you can have. We may not use all of them, but whatever we saw in that particular root tags that we saw under the data extension object, you can find them all here. For instance, if you saw there was customer key, the client was there, okay, then there was a data retention period, then there was a sendable, the name field was there. So there's many of these, like, the sendable data extension field, the sendable subscriber field. So all of these properties, whatever we want to use, we have to specify that, like, in the code. Okay, so now let's take a look at the example here. Come back to the example here. So here, if I look at client, okay, so the first property that I have under the data extension object is the client property, right? So I don't know how to like specify client. Is that just a property, or is it actually referring to another object, right? So for that we have to come back to the documentation here. Okay, so under data extension you will see the property client, and then you will see the data type is client ID. So it is not a regular data type like a string or a integer, or date time or a boolean. It's not something like that. Okay, it refers to another object called client ID. So what you need to do is you need to go find, is there another one called client ID? Yes, there is. Okay, so when you open that up, you will see, okay, client ID is another object, and these are the properties that are supported by that object. Okay, and then you will see, okay, so definitely ID is the one that you will need to mention for that specific one, right? So if I come back here into Postman, so you will see here the ID field. Okay, and this is actually being populated with our the MID of our org. Okay, it's the account ID of our parent BU. So that's the one that's actually going to be used here, and primarily this will be needed for few operations, like if you want to do the data retention and all that. If you don't specify the client ID, there will be a authentication or access permission issue. Like you might run into issue when you try to create the DE, right? So you will have to specify the client ID when you're doing it. Okay, so then looking at some of the other properties that we have, like the customer key, name, category ID, all these are in the root, right? So if I go back to the data extension, you will see that here, like the category ID is the folder. So these are all not different objects. So I can directly go ahead and specify the property there using the set object property. I can specify those values, customer key, etc. Right? But then let's look at if there is any other complicated tags here. Okay, so there is one here called sendable data extension field, right? So this one it actually has sub tags within it. Okay, so now we need to go and find out how do we actually want to be able to define this sendable data extension field. So if we now go back to the documentation here, let's go down to sendable data extension field. Again, when you look at it, you will see this is a type data extension field. Okay, so primarily when you are trying to define this property here under the object data extension, you have to create another object of the type the data extension field. Okay, and then you have to set these properties under that, and then add this as a property to the root object. Same thing like how we did with client. Okay, so client was, you had to create a client ID object, right? So probably I forgot to mention this. So client ID is a separate object, right? So you have to first create a client ID object, okay, and then we only need the ID property, right? So you have to set the ID property, and then we have to map it back to the root object here called data extension, and the property that it specifies is called client. Okay, so then you have to say that we want to map that particular client ID object that you created back to the data extension object using the property name client. Okay, and then you have already set the ID within that. Okay, so that's how it will be referring. You don't mention it as client ID here. The client ID is the type of the object. Okay, you have to refer to the actual name that the property under the data extension object. So if I go to the documentation here under data extension object, here you will see it is referring to as client. Okay, it's not, the type is client ID. Okay, the object type is client ID, but when you are putting it as the tag, or when you refer to the name of that particular property, it should always be what you see on the under the name column, not the data type. Okay, so don't get confused there. Okay, same thing for the sendable data extension field. It is the type of data extension field object, right? So if I go to data extension field object, I have to create a data extension field object. Okay, and then I have to set the properties that is relevant here. So if I go back to Postman, I will see, okay, what are the properties we need to set for this particular object that I just created here. I need to set the customer key, I need to set the name, and I need to set the field type. Okay, so if I go back to these three properties, customer key, name, and field type. So if I go here, customer key, string, okay, the name, you have to specify the name. Where is name here? Okay, name, and then field type. Okay, so field type. So you can specify a data extension field type. When I go to that, it will be it will have, like, the different types here. So if I open this, I'll show that shortly. The objects, data extension field type. So these are the different field types. So we are going to use text. So we can directly go ahead and use the value text here. Okay, so we don't have to create a sub object for that. Okay, so we'll go back here. So as you can see, we'll be able to specify each of these values and set those properties for the object that we created called sendable data extension field, and then we can add that in, okay, to the root object called data extension. Similarly, we need to find out, okay, what is the next set of tags that we need to prepare in the code, right? So it is sendable subscriber field. Okay, so now if we go back to the documentation to the data extension, you will see there is another property here called sendable subscriber field, which we have to set. Now this one, when you compare to the data extension field that was using the object data extension field, right? This one is using attribute. Okay, so this is another object that we have to go and create. So if you look at here, there is another object here called attribute. So if I click on this, it says these are the different values or properties under attribute. So we are actually using only the two fields here, the properties here, name and value. Okay, so name we are setting in a subscriber key, and value is blank. Okay, so I'll explain this when we do the actual coding, what each of these stand for. So the name and the value we will set. Value is blank here, but we will set those two. So if you come back to the documentation, you will see, yeah, these two properties are available. So if I create an object under attribute, I can then set the property for that particular object for name and value, and then I will have to map it back to the root object here as another property. Okay, so this is again another property that I have to add it back to the data extension. So just to summarize, just how you understand how to use the AMPscript functions. Primarily, you have to first create an object, the root object. Okay, then for every tag that you see on the root, you have to add that as a property to the root object. Okay, and if that object is actually, if that property is actually referring to another object type, like how you saw client, the sendable data extension field, the sendable subscriber field, if they're all different types of objects that you see from the documentation. So when you see the data extension here, if you look at the data type, if it's referring to another object, then you need to actually create them as separate objects. Okay, so for client, I will have created another object. For sendable data extension field, I will create another object, and for sendable subscriber field also I will create another object. Okay, so I will create instances of each of these objects. I will set the properties within those objects, and then I will map those properties to that object, and then that entire object I will then map it back to the as a property to the root object. Okay, so these ones are not child objects. Okay, so they are just property. So I can directly use using the set object property function, I can directly associate all these tags directly to the root object, data extension object. Okay. The ones that are that have an exception is that you have to first create the client, you have to then create these ones and then do their properties, then you have to do the sendable subscriber field and set their properties and then map it back to the root object. Okay. Now those are simple. Now we've come to the next part of the data extension, which is the fields. Okay. So we saw how we can use the create object, how we can actually set the object property, where we will use the set object property. Now this is where we are going to use the add object array item function. Okay. So if you look at our documentation, there is add object array item. So this one, if we go back to our Postman here, you will see that fields is actually the root tag. Okay, it's a property that you are having, and that one is actually an array of multiple fields. Okay, and what is this field? This is again a data extension field. And how do I know that? Again, documentation. So if I go here, if I go to fields, okay, it says it is an array of data extension field object. Okay, means each item inside an array, inside of the field, the array, the fields is an array. Okay, and each item inside that fields array is a type data extension field. Okay, so there are multiple items inside that array, each of them will be of the type data extension field. So in order to for us to create this, you have to create multiple objects. Each of those objects will be an instance of the data extension field type. Okay, the field, actually not type, field. Okay, so I will create the first object for data extension field. I will set the properties. Okay, this is the first field that I have. It will be customer ID, it will have text, maximum length, is it a required field, is it a primary key, all these things I will set. Okay, and then I will go and I will get the next field created. Okay, and then each of these fields I will go ahead and create. So as I create each field, I will add that as an array item into this array called fields. Okay, so that is how the logic works. You create the object, you set the properties, and then you add that object as an array item into the fields array. Okay, and then that is automatically will be getting mapped to the data extension root object as well. Okay, so we will see this in the code, how do we do that. Okay, so once you have set all of these properties, all the different properties and the child objects and their properties, and we have mapped everything to the data extension root object, then we will do the invoke create. Okay, and when you do the invoke create, it will create the actual data extension for us, and then we can see the return status code. Okay, so now we will look at the actual demo. So I'm in my contact builder under data extensions. This is the folder that I'm going to create the new data extension under. So if you look at the data here, I'm calling it test API DE2. The name is, that's the customer key. The name will be API series DE2, and the folder ID, this is the folder ID for my API series folder that we just saw under data extensions. Okay, so I've set the other properties here, the retention property will be for 1 month, and I'm saying this is a sendable data extension. Okay, and so these two things is primarily when you have a sendable data extension, you have to specify which field in the data extension you want to map as part of that sendable property, right? When you have configured data extensions, you would have seen which field do you want to map to the subscriber key, right? So we are specifying the customer ID field is the one that we are going to declare later. That field is the one that you need to map to the subscriber key on the attribute side. Okay, so this is that declaration here, and that is why we saw that this is a DE field object type, and this one is an attribute one. The attribute means it is part of the actual subscriber platform. Okay, so that is why it's an attribute object. Okay, and then we have the bunch of fields like the customer ID, the first name, the last name, email, and gender. So we have around 6 fields that we will create as well. Okay, so we'll now go ahead and start putting this into the actual AMPscript code. So I have the same setup as we had last time. I'm using VS Code. I'm now mapping this from Dropbox. So if I go back to our cloud page here, so you will see the Dropbox file rendering in landing page. So I'm using the treat as content. So as and when we actually type in the code and if we want to run it, we can do that. But I won't create the DE till I put in the entire code. Okay, so we will do all this step by step. I will add in each of the code lines for the properties and the objects. and then we will do the final update, and then we will see the DE getting created. Okay, so if you see our contact builder here, right now this particular folder doesn't have that API series DE2 data extension. Okay, it is still having only DE1. So after we run the SOAP API from AMPscript, we should be able to see the new DE here. Okay, so let me go ahead and start putting in the code. So as we discussed earlier, we will refer back to the Postman as well, so that we understand how the mapping is done, right? So the first thing we said, we have to create the root object, which is data extension. Okay, so I'm just setting a variable, and then I'm using the CreateObject function and saying we need to create an object of the type data extension, and then we are going to use that the variable DE to specify that. Okay, and then the final what operation that we need to do is we need to invoke create that particular DE, and then invoke create actually you have to pass the object that you want to create. Okay, and then you will get the status and the error if there is any error as part of that, right? So I'm actually messaging those out here as well. Okay, and then the create or DE, when you get the return from the invoke create function, it will usually show okay. If everything is all good, it will show okay, and if it is not okay, that means there is some error that happened, and you can use the error value to show the error message as well. Okay, so now in between this two statements, so this is the actual last statement that will be executed once you have set all the properties, right? The objects and all the properties under the data extension root object. So within this, we are now going to declare each of those different tags that we saw in Postman. Okay, so going back here, the first tag property that we need to set is client. Okay, so for that, like we saw in the documentation, we have to go and first create an object for client ID. Okay, so that was the object that we saw, right? If we go back to the documentation here, the client tag is of the object type client ID. Okay, so that is what we are creating here. Okay, and then we are setting it to as DE field. So that's just a temporary variable that I will keep reusing for adding creating multiple child objects and properties, and I'll keep adding that in. Okay, once I've created this object, okay, then what I'm saying is under this particular client ID object that I just created, okay, I want to set a property. Okay, and I have this particular ID that I have here. I want to map that in. Okay, so once I've added that in, okay, so then you will see that this property, this ID property, will be mapped to the object called the object that is created using the client ID object property. Okay, and then what I'm saying is the final one is, now that I have created this object using the client ID and the object type with the property ID, I need to map it back to the root object here. Okay, so let me club these together so that you know that this is coming together. Okay, so once I've done these two, I need to now map this client ID object that I just created, okay, back to the root DE object. So I'm going to say set object property. So basically that client is also a property of the root object. Na? So set object property, it will say of which one? The root object data extension, which is DE here. Okay, and what is the name that you have to give? Okay, so the syntax for set object property is you have to say which object you are going to set the property for, what is the name of the property, and what is the value of the property, right? So under data extension, we know that when you look at the documentation, the property name should be client. Okay, and what is the value that you need to see? The value is what we just defined here. We've created this. This is the whole set. So DE fields right now has the instance of that client ID object with a property ID with this value. Okay, so that entire thing will now get mapped as a property back to data extension. Okay, so by executing just this right now, okay, it is equivalent to having this here. Okay, so the remaining ones we need to go and slowly add. Okay, so now let's look at the remaining properties on the root level here. So we have customer key, name, category ID, data retention period length, is sendable. Okay, so these are very simple ones. So we can go ahead and directly add them as properties using the set object property function. Okay, so let me do that in the AMPscript code. So let me paste it here so that you can see. Okay, so if you see here, I'm using the set object property, and then I'm saying to the root object data extension, add each of these properties. Customer key, the value is test API DE2. The name, okay, is API series DE2. The description, this is the value. Category ID, then each of these properties I'm setting it over here. So the format, like I said, is to which object, what is the property name, and what is the property value. That is what we are doing. Okay, so once you have done this, this actually maps till here. We have done all the translation till here. Okay, so now we are now going to look at the sendable data extension field. Okay, so we need to look at this one. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this is and we have to find out what is the object type for this particular property. So going back to this one here, sendable data extension field is data extension field type, right? So we are going to create that object now. So let me put in the code and I'll show you how to declare that. Okay, let me put some space here. Okay, so now you will see we are now going to create an object of data extension field type. Okay, and then within that, let's see what are the different properties we need to set. We need to set customer key, we need to set name, and we need to set field type, right? So then, and each of the values also are there. So if we go back to our code, we will see we are setting the property for this particular object that we created. Okay, you need to make sure that you map it correctly to the right variable. If you do it by mistake to the DE variable, it will map it to the root, which is not what we want. We created a sub object here of the type data extension field, right? So to that object that you just created, you need to add customer key as a property with the value customer ID, name as a property with customer ID as the value, field type as a property with text as the value. Okay, so now I have that child object that we just created. Now once I have the child object, it is an orphan, right? I need to like map it to the DE here. Again, set object property to the root DE, the one that you have here, and then what is the name that you need to give for that property. Okay, we saw in from our envelope here, it is sendable data extension field, right? So that is the property that you need to specify, and we are saying, so to the root DE sendable data extension field, and what is that object that you are going to map? The one that you just set over here. Okay, so this is how you actually like go and find out if I need to like create a set of object and properties. This is how you do create object, set the object property, and then map it as a property back to the root object. Okay, so this is how for this one. Similarly, now we will look at how to do it for the sendable subscriber field. Okay, now sendable subscriber field, we saw it was not data extension field type. Okay, it was actually an attribute type. So here, okay, so for this one we will actually have to create it as a attribute object. So let me put the code for that one. Very similar to how we created the earlier one, but the only difference is the object name. So let me paste that here as well. So I'll just put some space so we can see the difference between each of these. Okay, so this one is for the sendable data extension field, and this is the subscriber, what is that one? Subscriber, sendable subscriber field. Okay. Okay, so here we have created the attribute object, and then we saw there was only two properties that we need to set. One is the name, which is subscriber key, and value is blank. Okay, so we are not passing any value for the blank. That is, if you wanted to do any filter, you can add the filter values here. Otherwise, we are going to say like all this customer ID, whatever field I have here, I want to map it to the subscriber key. Okay, so going back to the code here, I'm translating as is. I created the child object called that is of the type attribute. I am creating a property under that for name, which is subscriber key, value, which is blank. Okay, and then finally, once I have the child object, I have to map it back as a property, and again the property name is sendable subscriber field, and I am mapping this particular object that I created to the root DE. Okay, so for now we have created till here. Okay, till all the fields. So this is what we have created now. Okay, so the next set that we need to do is the fields. Okay, so this is where we have to look at the array item. Like we said, this is slightly different, right? So now we have to create an array item of various data extension fields. Okay, so we will create one field, and I will show you how to do that. Let me copy the code over. Going back here. Okay, so first we have to create an object again of the type data extension field. And why data extension field? If you look at the data here, you will see fields, Okay, we are trying to create a number of fields, right? And fields is an array, and each item in that array is a type of the object data extension field, right? So I'm actually creating a data extension field object here. Okay, and then I will set the property for that first field. Okay, the first field, the customer key is customer ID, the name is customer ID, the field type is text, max length is 50, is required is true, is primary key is true, is nillable is false. Okay, so these are some of the properties that I want to set. So let's quickly look at here. Yeah, so this is how all the properties are for that particular data extension field, right? And then once I have that, okay, how do I add this back to the DE? Okay, so that is earlier you saw it was like we were using the set object property, right? So we are not going to use that as a set object property anymore because it is not a property. Okay, in this particular case it is actually an array called fields. Okay, so you have to say to the root DE, I have an array called fields, and I want to add an item, okay, of the type data extension field with these properties to that array. Okay, so that is what this entire code does. Okay, so I hope you understood that we are using the create object to create a field, instance of a field, data extension field. We have set the properties for that particular field, and then because it is an array of fields, okay, we have set the property as like add object array item as a fields array. Okay, and to that fields array I am going to add the first item, which is the field I just created. Now this will get repeated, okay, because it is an add object array item, like fields is an array. I can repeat this multiple times, and I can keep on adding multiple fields that I keep on creating. Okay, so this is one field that we created. Now I have 5 more fields I need to create, right? So I'll go ahead and add that code as well here, so you will see how that entire code is being repeated. 1 second. Okay, so I just pasted that here. So you will see here the customer ID is the first one that we created earlier, but then after that I have the same logic. Okay, I'm again creating another child object of the data type data extension field. This time it is going to be first name, and what are the corresponding properties for first name I need to set, and then again repeat the same add object array item to that fields array. I want to add this new field that we just instantiated, right? Next one is last name. Again we add that to the fields array. Then we have email, add that to the fields array, and finally we have gender, add that to the fields array. So with this we have all the different tags that we had in the envelope we have already defined. Okay, so the final one is the object. It is the closing of that object tag, right? So if you look at the code now, you will see all the various objects, child objects, and the properties that you have created and how you have mapped it back to the primary root data extension object, right? And then final statement that we have is the invoke create. So now we have the entire DE, okay, that you have already set all the properties. You can go ahead and then do an invoke create, and then it will return back was it successfully done or not. Okay, so I've saved this code. Now let's go ahead and then run this over here by refresh, and if it is successful it says okay, and the status message is data extension is created. Okay, and error 0 means no error was returned. Okay, so let's go back to our contact builder. I will go ahead and refresh this one. Okay, so now you can see that API series DE2 is created. Let's go into the properties to confirm. So there were actually the 5 fields, actually not 6, sorry, my bad. So we have the customer ID, the first name, last name, email, and the gender field. So these 5 fields were created. And if you look at we've specified the length for each of those. So it was like 50 for the text ones, and the gender was 6, and then email we don't have to specify, it is defaulted 254. And you will see the customer ID was primary key, so it got correctly set. You will also see the customer ID is the one that we said should be related to the subscriber key, right? So that has been set. And even the data retention, we said for 1 month, it is expiring exactly 1 month, and we said all records should be deleted, so that property was also set. So you can see very easily that by executing that code that we had in AMPscript, we were easily able to map whatever envelope we had to the AMPscript code using these 3-4 functions that we had, and then just by running it automatically, we can see how easily we can actually create a data extension. Okay, so similar to this, you can explore other objects that we have in the documentation, like it's not just data extension, but any of the other objects that you want to create or you want to retrieve, like subscriber, if you want to get from account. So any of these, you can go and you can always work on this using the SOAP object, and then you can try that from AMPscript. So I hope this was very useful, and you will be able to work well with the SOAP objects, and it's no longer a mystery. You'll be able to, once you have the SOAP envelope from Postman or from SOAP UI that you have created before and is working fine, you'll be easily be able to translate that into AMPscript code, and then you can integrate using the functions that we have in AMPscript. Okay, thank you very much for watching.